Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second of Al-Shabaka's Policy Labs in 2022. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Nadim Bawalsa. I am the commissioning editor at Al-Shabaka, and I'm honored to be with you tonight facilitating this important discussion about transnational anti-normalization activism from the US to the Gulf. The US brokered Abraham Accords, which to varying extents normalized political, economic, and security relations between Israel and several Arab states, including Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Sudan, and Morocco, have received limited media coverage over the last few months. Yet Palestinians and their allies across the Arab world, the US and beyond, have been protesting the accords, which were introduced in 2020 by the Trump administration, through various platforms, whether on social media or in the halls of power. Giving voice to these silenced activists from the streets of San Francisco, Washington, D.C., Manama, Dubai, and beyond is particularly critical today, given the U.S. congressional caucuses, which formed earlier this year to push for expanding the normalization deals with Israel. What has been happening on Capitol Hill recently? How have anti-normalization activists been responding? Outside of the U.S., what do these normalization deals signify for the Arab residents of normalizing states? How can their voices be amplified within the context of increasingly authoritarian rule? Finally, what does a transnational anti-normalization campaign from the halls of the US Congress to the streets of Manama look like? To reflect on these questions and more, I'm joined this evening by anti-normalization activists Nadya Tannous and Sumaya Almajdoub. Nadya Tannous was Al-Shabaka's summer 2021 visiting US policy fellow. She's a passionate community organizer, born and raised in the Bay Area. I might mispronounce this, Nadya. You will tell us after. Olone territory? Close? Tell us. Ohlone territory. In her work, she focuses on political education, movement relationship building, anti-militarism, and returning land to the people and people to the land. Nadya holds a Master's of Science in Refugee and Forced Migration Studies from the University of Oxford and a BA in Anthropology and Global Information and Social Enterprise Studies from UC Santa Cruz. Sumaya Almajdoub is a researcher from Bahrain and a member of the Gulf Coalition Against Normalization, a group that seeks to support the Palestinian cause and mobilize against normalization with Israel and the Arab Gulf states. Thank you both for joining us this evening. Before we begin, as I usually do, I'd like to inform our viewers of the format of tonight's Policy Lab. We'll go back to the more traditional format of dividing up the next hour in half. For the first 30 minutes or so, I'll pose some questions to Nadya and Sumaya. During the second half of the lab, our speakers, will answer your questions. Throughout the discussion, please submit your questions by clicking on Ask a Question below. And remember that you can vote on the questions you'd like asked. If possible, please direct your question to one of our speakers. I'll do my best to get to as many of your questions as possible. So let's get right to it. Nadya, I'd like to start with you. In your capacity as Al-Shabaka's US visiting policy fellow last summer, you wrote an in-depth policy brief exposing the normalization agreements for what they are. Massive arms deals that maintain Israel's qualitative military edge in the region while arming Gulf states against Iran. You also stressed how the agreements normalize Israel's occupation and oppression of Palestinians. It's been a year and a half since the first states, Bahrain and the UAE, signed normalization deals with Israel, and since then, media coverage has definitely waned. Yet the implications of these deals are far from over. Can you tell us what's been happening in the US, especially in these last 2 months, both on Capitol Hill and amongst anti-normalizers in the US?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me back. It's good that I got to test the mic, so now I know it works. It was sticking earlier. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for those questions, Nadim. I think for those of us who have been trying to figure out what's happening with the omnibus bill the last few days, it's been a pretty dramatic ebb and flow and I don't know, discussion in Congress. I think something that's really important to note right now is that we have, as you said, the Abraham Accords that were kind of the hallmark of Trump policy in 2020. And then you have really, I think, silenced, like you said, by the media and in terms of general coverage on kind of where those Abraham Accords went, what's the status on normalization with Israel, and what's the status, what's happened now with some of the weapons sales, massive weapons sales that were a quintessential part of the Accords themselves. I think what we can do now, and the reason I start with the omnibus bill, is because we're seeing actually in terms of funding to Israel, the $3.8 billion to Israel was part of the SFOPS portion of the domestic spending bill and the omnibus bill, and now you have the $500,000 plus the $1 billion Iron Dome funding placed into the international or the defense part of the omnibus bill. So what's really scary about having $5 billion to Israel being packaged into a bill that's an omnibus bill that's supposed to basically keep the lights on, right, for the United States, since we've been unable to pass a budget, this government. Of course, the House voted in the omnibus bill late last night, yesterday. What's really concerning about then putting all of this funding for Israel, again, $5 billion into that bill, is that it pits kind of this good faith bipartisan policy against any real ability for representatives to speak their opinions on the different segments, all the different things that are within this bill, including funding to Israel. So to give an example, certain representatives who might be anti the $3.8 billion in principle, so I could give an example of, or the Iron Dome funding. So we can talk about Cori Bush, for example, or Rashida Tlaib. So those two who would be progressive on the Palestinian issue and be against the $3.8 billion spending domestically, right, in the bill, would be forced in many ways to vote for that, because they would have to vote for the larger legislation in order for their own districts to get domestic funding. And so what you see is this pitting of false solutions. Are you either going to have a budget for, this government and for the United States to function, or are you going to make this about some unrelated issues? So I think that's one. We know that that's generally how some of U.S. policy generally works, is these false equivalencies. And so I think we can also see it in the case of international spending around some of the conversations I've heard between, are we going to send a delegation to Iran to talk about what Iranian oil production and an energy partnership with the U.S. looks like, or are we going to back Putin, right? And so there's, anyways, the floor has been full of these false equivalencies, or false options, I should say, which makes it really, really hard, for example, for certain representatives, like I said, who are progressive, to speak their minds. In the Israel Normalization Act, HR 2748, what's important to highlight there is that it was passed yesterday by the House, and there isn't a budget line that's connected to it, but it was part of the larger omnibus bill. And we know that there was a lot of support for HR 2748, unfortunately, in the government. But the question that I would ask is, why did it not go to a floor vote? And I think one of the reasons why it would be beneficial for these things to go to a floor vote is so that even if it passes, we're able to actually have a discussion and a forum around why normalization with Israel is so harmful, why the Normalization Act holds certain dangerous precedences, and why, and connecting back to your larger question, Nadim, how the Abraham Accords and the intent of normalization is living within different forms of legislation, right, and different bodies within the government. So, okay, the Abraham Accords passes. Now we have HR 2748 that's actually trying to take language around normalization of Israel and then create methods of monitoring who is pushing normalization forward with Israel, how they're doing, right? Different bodies, how they've done basically in terms of upholding the intent of the accords. And then I believe they're also, as we see more legislation introduced in the coming cycles, I think we should really keep a lookout for different ways that the United States and Israel supporters are going to try and enforce normalization. So what are the mechanisms of actually making these things transpire and happen on the ground? I'm really excited to be here on this panel with Sumaya, because I think one of the questions we also have to look to is how some of this normalization efforts and these upcoming laws are also going to impact the ability for grassroots organizers to advocate against Israeli apartheid and occupation and for Palestinian rights to freedom and liberation in their contexts in normalizing Arab Gulf and Gulf states. So I just maybe we'll the last thing I'll say is that I think it's really important for us as organizers and of people of conscience who want to frame what Israeli normalization actually means, is to actually step away from the term normalization and actually talk about what that is. So it's about cementing. So the Abraham Accords are a weapons deal. It's about funding Arab regimes and authoritarian states, and in exchange for them to actually support Israeli political aspirations and human rights abuses against Palestinians, they in turn get support from one of the most powerful countries in the world, the United States, in cementing their own hegemony in the region. So it means that certain states, if they want to continue to wage war in Yemen, they get a big bump of support and weaponry in order to do that. If Saudi Arabia wants to continue to increase its forces against Iran and to continue to have that regional struggle, those countries who want to get on board on Saudi's side are able to actually do that. All they have to do is align themselves politically with Israel, and the US will give them one of the best weapons deals they've seen in the history of this country.
Nadya, thank you so much for this sobering sort of update on what's happening in the US scene, reminding us that even if we don't hear about it in the news, these massive monster deals are underway in this very insidious way, through sort of surreptitious channels. Things do get pushed through. Speaking of authoritarianism, maybe it's time to turn to the other side of the world to get a sense for what this looks like over here in the Middle East. Sumaya, I'm so honored and happy that you were able to join us. As a Bahraini activist, you're part of several significant anti-normalization initiatives regionally. They've originated and spread among Arab activists in the Gulf, including in Gulf states that have normalized. This is unprecedented for many of our viewers, I'm sure, who would not have heard about this. But for different reasons, of course, coverage on these movements and on this activism in the Gulf is limited, and voices like yours have been silenced and are being silenced. Can you tell us more about the Gulf scene, if we can call it that, both in terms of the implications of the agreements themselves and about the reactions and responses of Arab residents themselves that we don't get to hear? Of course, as is the case in many countries over the world, in all states, what happens at the state level in many cases contradicts what is happening at the popular level. So please, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Nadim, for this introduction, and also for Nadya on kind of like setting the scene for today's conversation. And I think the distinction that you just made is really, really important. So what happens on the state level does not necessarily, and often does not, represent popular opinion or what happens from society's point of view. So I think that's definitely a critical point for us to keep in mind when we're looking at the reactions and implications of these normalization agreements happening in the Gulf, especially since we're noticing a lot of sort of academic normalization, intellectual. So there's a lot of efforts to move beyond official diplomatic relations into a lot of trade relations. And so this is quite dangerous, I have to say, because this wasn't the case necessarily when other countries in the region normalized, like Egypt, for example, or Jordan. That people-to-people aspect was not really kind of like the focus of these normalization efforts. So to give a bit of a background for our viewers today on the Gulf scene. So one of the organizations that I'm a member of is the Gulf Coalition Against Normalization. It's an umbrella coalition that, excuse me, brings together 4 anti-normalization organizations, each one based in a country in the Gulf. So you have BDS Gulf, which is the BDS chapter in Kuwait, BDS Kuwait. And we have the Bahraini Society Against Normalization. In Bahrain, we have Qatar Youth Against Normalization in Qatar, and also a Gulf chapter for an organization called Youth for Quds, and they have chapters in the Gulf. So, and these are just examples of 4 organizations that have existed for many, many years. Like the Bahraini Society Against Normalization was founded officially in the year 2000. So it even was founded before BDS was officially launched in the early 2000s. So, and definitely the rise of BDS was really important because I think one of the key principles that we really focus on in our efforts to support the Palestinian cause and to oppose normalization is collective effort. So we know we don't exist in a vacuum, that we have to build bridges with other movements and organizations. So organizations, and I think BDS was a really critical movement. Maybe we can talk about later on in some examples in the Q&A. So this is one kind of aspect of anti-normalization, and I think a lot of the state narrative tried to paint a picture that everybody agrees on these acts and agreements, but honestly, we can try to measure popular opinion, and oftentimes it's difficult. And when we do that, we do notice that there is no popular support, none whatsoever, in supporting these normalization efforts. And even if sometimes some of the official state narratives are being bought by certain segments of society, a lot of what's happening in Palestine itself really just diminishes all of that effort. So if we look at the example of what happened in Hayy Sheikh Jarrah, a lot of the local mobilization that was happening inside Jerusalem and inside Palestine was really effective in really just shattering all of the official state narratives that normalization is good, that it's strategic, or that it's what we should eventually do. And so I think that the voices of Palestinian youth to youth in the Gulf are so much more powerful than official state narratives, especially in the age of social media and just online solidarity. I think that really is a critical point when we look at this kind of opposing narratives. Another point I want to mention is there is a lot of historical continuity. So these movements that I'm a part of, civil society in the Gulf that supports the Palestinian cause, these movements have not started now or even in the 2000s. There's historical evidence even in Bahrain that we had local protests during the year of the Nakba, so 1947, 1948. Literally, the streets of Manama were paralyzed because everybody was on the streets protesting against the British, because the British were actually still had control over Bahrain. And so there was a lot of sort of early on, we're talking about early on in the 1930s and 40s, this consciousness and collective consciousness that opposing Israel is simply, it's a national struggle, it's an anti-colonial struggle, it's a struggle that Bahrainis know about, especially because in the Gulf, Bahrain was more under direct British rule compared to other Gulf countries. So definitely this is ingrained in the collective understanding of Bahrainis and Gulf people in general. So there is historical continuity, there's a focus on collective action. We're not in a vacuum. We have to build bridges with other international movements. And lastly, maybe I'll just mention the importance of boycotts. So if you look at, a country like Qatar, for example, it's going to host the 2022 World Cup, and there's a lot of kind of efforts, direct and indirect, to do a lot of sports normalization. And for example, the Qatar Youth Against Normalization, the youth group in Qatar is working really hard to focus on the dangers of this. And so there's a lot of kind of tracks that local grassroots organizations are working on. And another point also, like with collective action, is that the Gulf is a very diverse place. We are 6 countries, each with its own local context, and there's about 50 million people who live in the Gulf, and they disagree on a lot of things. One of the things they all agree on is Palestine, is opposing normalization. And how can we find evidence of this? I'll use the example of my country, Bahrain. When there was news of signing the Abraham Accords, all of the, we have 7 political associations in Bahrain, each association, so they're parties, but legally they're called associations, each one representing a different political flavor. So we have leftists, we have conservatives, we have liberals, we have different types of political thinking locally, and all of them signed on to a joint statement, petition, saying that we all collectively we all collectively oppose these normalization efforts. And then also in Bahrain, there's an active civil society. We have a lot of women's groups, youth groups, unions, and they all came together under a national umbrella, which is called the National Initiative to Oppose Normalization. And more than 20 NGOs in Bahrain have signed on to that initiative. And so, it's definitely, it's a pleasure for me to be with you today and to talk about these efforts, because if you are on the ground in the Gulf, you know about these things. It's difficult to talk about these things in official media, and oftentimes people do mix what the state has to say and what people have to say. So I think it's important for us to make that distinction and to see what's happening on the ground.
Thank you so much, Sumaya, for giving us an explanation of the Gulf scene, as we've been calling it, and just the extent to which there's a diversity of opinion, of politics, of inclinations, of rhetoric, but Palestine remains the unifying element, which is something that seems so contradictory, perhaps, or so surprising, given, for example, here in Amman and Jordan, when we hear about tourism opening up between Israel and the UAE, you hear these really sort of frustrating, frankly, stories about Israeli tourists in Dubai and vice versa, or Emirati tourists in Tel Aviv, and then you think, well, where's the consciousness? Where's the response to this from those local communities? But as you mentioned in the end, it's difficult to discuss these in official these realities in official media. So you also mentioned the importance of bridging or coming together as collectives. So I want to ask you both the same question, because you're both coming from 2 very distinct contexts, but you are working on the same sort of work, activism. So Nadya, let's go back to you. Can you tell us, from your experience, what would a strategic transnational anti-normalization movement look like? One that combines voices from the Gulf with activists in the US, across the world. What actual steps can be taken to sort of bring this together?
Yeah, I guess we're speaking to something that we're building now. I think I really appreciate, Sumaya, your perspective and talking about grassroots organizers and popular movements that are coming out of Gulf nations. I think that's the key, is to actually connect internationally people who are working on similar campaigns, either in their context, so fighting normalization in their domestic context, or really connecting and trying to think about what a broad-based campaign looks like that would be effective and could operate on an international level in order to challenge normalization, which is becoming and is unfortunately kind of the dominant wave right now between our different nation states. So I think, it's, again, I'll just say that, we have in the omnibus bill $5 billion in expenditures towards Israel and funding towards Israel. And I think that is the largest that we have ever seen. And so it's really noteworthy. It's really important, I think, at this time to not just highlight what normalization and what the Abraham Accords are about, but to really focus on those that are making mass amounts of profit from violence and war, and highlighting the cost that everyday people have to pay. And so I think in that, a response is looking at the different war profiteers who are, making a boodle off of normalization and off of this round of different crises that are being frankly manufactured, like in Yemen. I think something that we've done as grassroots organizers in the United States is actually focus on base building between different movements like the Filipino movement, immigrant movements, Palestinian movements, and of course back in indigenous movements, but focusing on, okay, if Boeing is in your area, what is Boeing doing in the case of Palestine? What's their imprint in the case of the Philippines? And let's really have a conversation. We could talk about Elbit. What's Elbit's imprint on the landscape in the so-called United States? Well, there's a big one along the US-Mexican border. And I think, we as movements have to get really smart about connecting across our issues in order to target and focus on the same forces and, or in this case, corporations who are profiting off of and also manufacturing our demise in conjunction with authoritarian and non-democratic states. And so I think that's really, really critical. I will say, I brought up an example of Elbit along the US-Mexico border. I think what's also important is looking at how in the omnibus bill, again, you have this huge amount of funding for DHS and ICE in the same bill. So we as Palestinians are not the only ones who got screwed over by this false foreign policy and good faith bipartisanism, right? There's a lot of movements and a lot of issues that really, really were forced to be pitted against each other. And I think that, to me, there are many organizations, US Campaign, JBP, IMEU, DCIP here who are doing great work on the congressional level every day. For us as organizers and grassroots organizers, I would say that's not the space that we're going to be making huge moves. We can see a $5 billion expenditure. Our demands from that, I think, need to be, how do we replace, how do we restrict, how do we cut any further funding to Israel? We really have to look at what that tool of S and BDS would be in our context, and what it means for progressives to utilize sanctions as a tool, because sanctions are historically and presently a tool of the right. So we really have to think about it. I think maybe lastly, I'm curious to think, for us as Palestinians who are living in the diaspora, what it means for us to also bridge those connections with other Palestinians and other communities of Palestinians all over the world, and Arab. What does it mean for all of us to really think about how we're going to create a force that takes head on some of the profiteering and really nasty political business that's happening in our region? Because at the end of the day, we are the ones who are sacrificed by that. And I think it's really critical to think about how we can use, our protracted exile, 73 years, to our benefit, because now we live in different countries that make up part of this international community. So I think the short answer is that it's up to us in terms of people, power, and movements to actually build relationships and then strategize what next steps can be.
Thank you, Nadya, very much. Sumaya, just to quickly paraphrase the question and go right back to you, what does a strategic transnational anti-normalization movement look like, one that brings activists in the US and the Gulf together, and what steps can be taken to achieve this?
Yeah, thank you for this really important question. I think, our conversation today definitely illustrates one of those ways of connecting voices in different areas for the same cause. I do want to mention, we can talk about BDS, for example, and it's not the only example of this movement that was started by Palestinians and today has worldwide reach and has reach in the Gulf as well. So I do want to mention an example of how we in the Gulf can work together with international campaigns to put pressure. So in 2014, there was a global campaign issued by BDS to boycott one of the companies, Viola, which is a French company that had a project on occupied Palestinian territories to build a railway, so train railway. So they had this global campaign to boycott this French company and try to put pressure for each person in their own local context to put pressure on this company so that it would withdraw from Palestine. And indeed, BDS Kuwait worked really, really hard. They had a national campaign to push the Kuwaiti municipality, so the capital municipality, to end all of their contracts with Viola. And indeed, they were able to be successful with this campaign, causing losses of millions of dollars to Viola, which also contributed to the global losses that Viola was suffering as a result of this campaign. And they eventually they had to pull out of occupied Palestine. So, this is an example of where we in the Gulf, there's a lot of international campaigns that are put on that are on the lists of companies that are complicit in the occupation of Palestine. And so from where we stand, from where we are in the Gulf, we can target those companies and try to put pressure on them. There's other companies like HP, if we're talking about sports companies like Puma. There's also a campaign now to boycott Puma because they also sponsor the Israeli sports team. So we are definitely aware that one of the most important and effective ways for us to work is to work collectively and join those campaigns. I do want to add another example, perhaps more on a regional level, which really shows us the importance of boycotts. And boycotts are important for two reasons. They do cause direct economic losses, but they are an incredible advocacy tool. So once you issue a boycott campaign, people are aware about what's happening and they can contribute, even if symbolically, by boycotting a company that's complicit. In the 1960s, the Arab League issued a joint resolution that all Arab states signed on to, that they would have boycott offices in their local countries to boycott Israeli goods or goods that have somehow been going through Israeli ports and things like that. So those offices have existed in the 1960s up until recently. For example, in Bahrain, we also had this office. It was a regional boycott office, and it existed up until the year 2006. Why did it close in the year 2006? Because at the time, Bahrain was negotiating a free trade agreement with the US government. And during the discussions in Congress, they said, well, we can't sign a free trade agreement if Bahrain has this boycott office. And they put pressure so that this office is closed. So what does this tell us? It tells us if the entirety of the United States would not sign an agreement until this small boycott office is to be closed, it shows us the importance of such initiatives and the importance of boycotting. So I think that's definitely one of the important aspects and tools we can use. Another element is, and I mentioned this to you in our previous discussion. There's a lot of Gulf students are studying in American universities and European universities, and a lot of them have been exposed to other different social justice movements and different tracks like the BDS movement, Students for Justice in Palestine, and even for example, the Israeli Apartheid Week. week as sort of like a solidarity and advocacy tool has been implemented in Qatar for many years now. So they have events marking this week in Qatar for I think since 2011 or 12, I'm not sure. So so there's a lot of we're trying to learn on what's happening internationally, building bridges. And of course, definitely one of the most important aspects is building connections and networking with Palestinians themselves inside Palestine and Palestinians outside of Palestine. And so I think these are some of the tools or ways that we can strengthen international solidarity for Palestine.
Thank you very much, both of you, for these very insightful answers. I want to get us right into the Q&A because we have our first question is actually about BDS and really, let's say, seizing the moment of boycotting. So our audience member asks, to what extent can the powerful and officially legitimized cascade towards boycotting and sanctioning Russia for its invasion of the Ukraine be used to reframe BDS's campaign for Western eyes? Should you believe that it should be reframed? Let's start with Nadya in the US, in the West, let's say, and then return to Sumaya for some of your insight into the effectiveness of BDS and what it can look like.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think we can always draw lessons from different efforts of sanctions, whether they are good or bad, right? Whether regardless of intent, we can say, right? I think it's tough to really think about sanctions as an effective tool at this point in time, specifically by the United States towards Israel, because they're the best of friends. And I think, conceptualizing what it looks like for the United States to sanction a government and a state that it wholly supports and coordinates with is really different than thinking about the United States sanctioning Russia. I know that that's perhaps a pretty obvious statement, but I do think that while this is a moment that we can think about, okay, what are some things that the international community were willing to do in order to call Russia into account, that they're not willing to do every day around the onslaught of Israel against Palestinians. I think, that's the hypocrisy of the moment that we're living in. And so it's the right question. It's a good question. I'm not sure how we can really take some of the things that are happening now and apply them to the essence sanctions for Israel. I think really what we need to look at is the different avenues that have been explored in this sense, perhaps also looking at the case of South Africa, though we can definitely debate whether or not that was effective and what the pitfalls were. I think we can maybe look at some of those examples too and see what we come up with. This is the thing that we're going to have to answer coming forward around restricting and removing funding for the Israeli state and Israeli military funding.
Sumaya, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you. I mean, maybe the only thing I'll add to Nadya's point is, I think, first of all, I think for people in the region, like the double standard goes without saying. Like, all crimes are not equal. It depends on who is committing them. So this is kind of goes without saying. And I think, I think maybe what's happening now is that, everything really depends on political will. So if there is political will to put pressure on a certain actor, then people and organizations and countries are going to mobilize with all of their might. If there is no political will, then they simply will not. So then the question becomes, how can we push or create that political will where it is lacking? So that would be my 2 cents.
Thank you. We have another question, but before getting to it, I guess I have a question for both of you in terms of this strategizing aspect of creating a transnational anti-normalization movement. We discussed the last time we spoke the role of social media and youth, and since you're both sort of so in it, I, as the editor, and once a month facilitate these conversations, I'm very much sort of in the background. I would love to hear more about what strategizing at that level, at the social media level, amongst youth, this new generation, Gen Z, what is there something optimistic or hopeful that we can look to, given that we've had decades of suppressing this kind of mobilization, even on social media platforms? We just saw Vogue magazine removing the word Palestine from Gigi Hadid's promise to give her money to the Ukrainian Palestine. Any insight into this would be great. Sumaya, should we?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I mean, definitely. I mean, I think social media, with all of its challenges, does give a really, really important avenue and space for people to express their opinion, to mobilize. Despite the fact that a lot of times these spaces have been kind of like hacked and hijacked, and with different systematic campaigns to have certain discourses out there. So, for example, like in the Gulf, one of the ways that normalization has been, packaged is, using, first of all, a very defeatist discourse of, well, it's been 70 years, we might as well just sign agreements, kind of like a very defeatist discourse of, it's inevitable, it's going to happen, there's no way to stop it. That's one aspect. Another aspect was kind of like trying to package normalization with a settler colonial state as religious tolerance. So this fallacy of equating a religion, Judaism, with a political movement, the Zionist movement. So this fallacy has been used a lot. We've noticed in this time of trying to promote the Abraham Accords, and definitely it's a fallacy. And how does this fallacy kind of like fall apart is when you go on social media and you open the lives of Palestinians who are on the ground. We're talking about people like Mohammed al-Kurd, Mona al-Kurd, or many others who just will open, their phone cameras and take photos and videos of what's happening to them on the ground in Palestine, of the brutality that they're facing, of the injustice that they're facing. And that really just diminishes all of these types of fallacies and discourses that you see on social media. So I think that connection, that direct people-to-people connection is really critical, and it's something that we have to build on. So that's one aspect. And I think also, like, even for us as the Gulf Coalition or different organizations, since spaces for, especially, getting permits to hold a demonstration or things like that has been really, really difficult post the Arab Spring in 2011. It's almost impossible. And then after COVID, of course, these physical types of events or meetings are really difficult. So everything has shifted online. And there's a lot of benefits. So even with the Gulf Coalition, we've had a lot of online panels and discussions with Palestinians. So it's much easier to send Zoom links rather than having somebody travel in and have a discussion. So I think it opened up a lot of avenues to build connections and to build bridges. It's allowed for this direct connection between people-to-people connection to really know what's happening on the ground from the people who are experiencing what's happening. So maybe that's one. I'll mention another example. So the Gulf Coalition also, at the time of the Abraham Accords, we had this online petition, us and a number of other organizations. It was a simple online petition where we wanted anybody who opposed the accord to simply just sign off with their name. We managed to get 2 million signatures in the span of like 2 weeks. We ourselves were really surprised. So this was targeted at people in the Gulf to sign, and it was an online petition. So even though you probably can sign anonymously, but this just shows you, it just reflects for you what people will say when they are given the chance. So I think that's the other critical point. If you have the freedom to say what you want to say, then you're going to find support for Palestine and opposition for normalization.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Sumaya. Nadya, if you want to say something to that question. Otherwise, there's a new question for you. So let's get to that question directed specifically to Nadya. I'll just read it. Based on what Nadya discussed about how establishment politicians often smuggle funding for Israel into larger bills and coerce politicians into voting for it by holding their own districts hostage for funding. That's a brilliant summary. What are some more ideas for how we can challenge this, even as we don't view electoral politics as the ultimate horizon for liberation?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, I don't work on congressional issues every day. I think something that would be helpful, however, is forcing certain votes, right? So in terms of the Normalization Act, again, so we know that we have a bipartisan caucus on the Abraham Accords. We know that, as Sumaya used the term brilliantly, there is a mass political will to have normalization, mechanized and implemented beyond just language into actual actions and metrics and, different policies. And so I think what's really important is that we need to force certain votes. With the Normalization Act, it would have been great for people to get on the floor. We'll see that it will pass regardless, but to actually have folks who are against this talk about why, right? And bring some of the voices that and opinions that we have onto why normalization is so such a problem and so insidious to actually the floor, and to actually force folks to vote. So we need a record on where folks are standing, rather than being able also for representatives to just slip through the cracks along with the legislation, say, well, what am I supposed to do about the normalization bill? It was pitted against, it was pitted against, relief for Ukrainian refugees, which it was in this case, right? So don't we all want to support Ukrainian refugees? So why are you making a big deal about the Normalization Act? Instead, we should have really had a moment to hash that out and have folks take a stand and talk about why. And I think as Palestine becomes less of a or as Israel, let's say, becomes less of a uniting issue, I think we'll actually see a split on, and particularly the Democratic Party. And I think there is some power in that. And I wonder if the Democrats are scared, frankly, of showing that on that level. I think something else, just in terms of maybe uniting that with an answer around grassroots and social media organizing, grassroots organizing, reflecting that on social media, is thinking about the way that Israel consistently tries to rebrand itself and Zionism tries to rebrand itself. And I think, we see that they were a proud settler colonial movement in the 20s. We see that they then rebranded to a national liberation struggle during the 60s and 70s. And we're seeing now that they're branding themselves from a conservative movement to a progressive movement. I think something that we have to do as organizers here on the ground is actually push back on why Zionism is not and will never be part of a progressive canon. And that means things like the Palestinian Youth Movement and other organizations were really focusing on the Anti-Defamation League and talking about, dropping the ADL. So meeting with other movement organizations and talking about why the ADL should not be part of different progressive coalitions, and really unmasking the normalization of Israel and of Zionism in our locales, in our cities, within our progressive organizational coalitions, etc. So I think it has to happen on all levels. But I do think that even though you get much more political stock for supporting Israel than you do supporting Palestine, which I think a lot of politicians see as like an expenditure of their, their tokens, their political tokens. I think we definitely are seeing a shift. Supporting Israel full stop is not perhaps the united position as it once was 10 years ago. So I think even as things are moving slowly, we do have to note that. That's what I would say at this time.
Thank you, Nadya. And having lived almost 20 years in the US, I fully agree. And you make this point in your brief, which we shared with the audience in the chat, to truly look at the polls and the shifting tides, let's say. Let's have one more question for Sumaya, which I think is a very sort of poignant question, really brings us to the Gulf, something that our audiences likely don't hear much about. So how do you think the Abraham Accords have affected or will affect or are affecting the Arab Palestinian immigrants in Gulf countries moving forward, especially in states that have normalized?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think definitely if we just take a moment to acknowledge that Palestinian communities in the Gulf have existed since the establishment of nation states really in the Gulf. So a lot of the Palestinian teachers that came in the 1960s, 70s, even before, were really important in building educational systems in the Gulf. So that's like just kind of like building off that. And I mean, I think so. It's a really good question because there's two sides to it. So the first side is having those connections of Palestinian communities inside the Gulf informing people in the Gulf. So you have, again, the direct people-to-people kind of engagement that's really critical. You have a lot of Palestinian clubs or associations in universities in the Gulf also have a critical. There's Students for Justice in Palestine in one of the campuses in Qatar. So there's a lot of kind of so the Palestinians themselves that exist in the Gulf are also part of that kind of network to be part of that solidarity network. So I don't know. That's kind of like the first thing that comes to mind. I mean, there's other things, maybe there's not enough time to discuss, but definitely, for example, there's a lot of historical injustices that happened to Palestinian communities, especially in Kuwait after the invasion of Kuwait. And that's definitely something that, that sort of collective punishment of entire communities is really not accepted. It's definitely viewed in a critical way. It wasn't, it wasn't supported in the popular level. So, definitely, there's like a mixed history, I think, and a lot of Palestinians were affected by those decisions. But at least, if we're talking about now and in the future, I think that, the spaces maybe to express, maybe to have their political opinions expressed is definitely diminished, as it is for everybody else who lives in those contexts. But definitely, I think I would really stress the importance of how knowledge and solidarity is built and the influence of Palestinians who live in the Gulf to actually feed into that, collective support for Palestine. So that would be my answer.
Thank you so much, Sumaya, for that, and maybe to get at one other question that was just posed, and that sort of it might seem like a no-brainer. That of course the Gulf countries with authoritarian policies on access to the internet and so on. How do you navigate? How does activism look like when there are so many blocks to the internet and
exactly.
Accessibility?
Yeah, I know it's a good question. And I think actually, I mean, there's ways to also be smart about it. It's like, for example, there was one panel that the Bahraini Association Against Normalization is a licensed NGO because when it was founded, this was the official state position. So it's, it is still until this day, illegally, it exists in a legal sense. So whenever they host events or they need permits to book things or hold events and things like that. So they had a few months ago, they had an online panel, which they were hosting that talks about Palestinian solidarity. And in the middle, so in the first few minutes after the first speaker spoke, they get a phone call from the Ministry of Labor, which is where they're licensed under, telling them, oh, you don't have the license anymore to hold this online event and you have to shut it down. So they shut down the event. What's actually happened is that really raised the publicity of that panel. So, I think it just shows, so even though they were not able to finish that online panel, they were censored in a way, that actually raised, so even though maybe some of their activities or videos would not have that many views, but because there was this kind of like direct intervention, it's raised the publicity of what happened. So that's like on one aspect. Another aspect is, like I said, you just have to be smart about navigating those spaces online. I mean, I think this is a question that's relevant everywhere. Like you see people even inside the United States, where you theoretically should have more space to talk about things and be critical. People who support Palestine or part of the BDS movement also face restrictions professionally. It also comes with a cost. So I think it's something that's the challenges are different in each context, but in many ways they do exist everywhere. But definitely online spaces do give you a little bit more of an opportunity to navigate it.
Yeah, certainly even here in Jordan, presumably a more progressive state regionally, but absolutely there are many folks do need to find alternative ways to access information and distribute it online. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I can't believe it's been an hour already. I actually think we just started a few minutes ago. Thank you so much, Nadya and Sumaya, for joining us this evening and for bringing these developments in the Abraham Accords and in anti-normalization efforts to our attention. You've shown that the Abraham Accords are far from over, whether in Washington or on the streets of cities worldwide. You've also shown that solidarity is alive and well among Arab residents of states that have normalized, and that we need to work with them to push back not only against normalization, but against the authoritarian structures under which they live. Allyship works two ways, of course. In fact, you highlighted that these efforts, these collective anti-normalization mobilization efforts are underway. They are within reach. So it's about seeing them, recognizing them, and engaging them. Thank you for this invaluable insight and for the incredible work that you both do. Nadya, good morning to you. I know it's very early on the West Coast. So thank you so much for being with us. I'd also like to thank our audience all over the world for attending this lab and for submitting your engaging thoughts and questions. There were several shout outs from close friends of yours in the chat, so I'd just like to recognize that there is tremendous support and love out there for the work that we do. Before we sign off, I'd just like to remind everyone that Policy Labs are a crowdfunded program of Al-Shabaka, so we do rely on your continued support. If you're able to donate, please do so by clicking on the donate link that should now appear on your screens. And otherwise, it was really lovely to chat with you both. Thank you so much, and good night, everyone.
Thank you so much.